So at the start of the very last week of January 2026, Jim Lee, the president of DC Comics, posted a statement on Twitter commenting on the current status regarding the manga and comic book industries. And as you all pretty much know by now, he went in and blatantly stated how anime and manga is beating out Western comics. Well, okay, he didn't say it in those exact words. He simply wrote that in terms of sales and readership, manga currently has the advantage over American comics, but it's basically the same difference. Especially since he also wrote down how Western comics are lacking in something that anime and manga have, and how he admired that the two are incredibly powerful. He even made several other reasons of what makes manga so much better than Western comics. Plus, in another post later on, it would state that One Piece will surpass the sales of Superman comics at the end of the year, so it's proof that Lee's statement is a complete false. Now, as someone who is mostly a manga reader, I wholeheartedly agree with what he has said, and while I can't say too much about Western comics as I rarely read any of them, I do have some opinions of why I think reading manga is much more preferable than reading comics. They more or less correspond with what the president of DC Comics thinks, but they are a bit more detailed, as they are still based on what I know thus far about the nature between manga and comic books. With all this said, welcome to Animanko 9000, a channel where we talk about anime, manga, and artistic media related content. And within this video, I'll be discussing about why and how manga is doing much better than Western comics. Also, if you want to hear more of the contents I mentioned earlier, just subscribe to my channel and hit that notify bell. So to start off, looking at this portion of Jim Lee's statement of how manga is more like literature, it really aligns with my biggest personal take of why I think manga is much more easier to dive into than comic books, as well as the issues I have with the latter. In this case, unlike how most manga series would contain at least one well-structured and concrete storyline, with a beginning, middle, and end, Western comics usually don't have any of that. Instead, they mostly have standalone stories and an origin story that acts as its root. And honestly, that single factor makes a very huge difference to how manga is greatly succeeding. I mean, that's not to say that these types of stories are a bad thing. Some of them are good and famous in their own right, such as 3 of Marvel Comics' biggest and most well-known events like Infinity War, Civil War, and Secret War. And for the ones that help refine the DC comic universe, there's Crisis on Infinite Earths and Infinite Crisis. Plus, I will admit, Western comics do have a much wider expansion in storytelling than manga, although it is mainly because comic book industries are more lenient with whatever story is being made and released to the public. But because of this approach, we do get all kinds of adventures that comic book fans can follow through, and various versions of superheroes they might want to explore. For instance, in regards to classic Spider-Man and his variants, if you want to see versions where Peter Parker isn't the only famous web crawler, then we have Miles Morales, the Spider-Man from the OG Ultimate Universe, Penny Parker, whose own spider power mostly revolves around piloting a mech and linking up to a radioactive spider, and finally Gwen Stacy, the alternate version of Peter's first love interest, who also goes by Spider-Gwen. Just as well, if you want to see versions that come from different alternate time periods, then there's Spider-Man Noir and Spider-Man of 2099. Of course, if you want to see one Spider-Man that is much weirder than the rest, then we got something like Spider-Ham. Frankly, the possibilities are endless, and it's partially the reason why Western comics are still enjoyable in some way. However, at the same time, it also ends up being a main problem, because by having this many stories to go by, the comic book industry will eventually become oversaturated, and some of them already are. As a result, not only is it much harder to keep track of these said stories, it's also a lot difficult to follow along at what is going on within them. More so since each comic book issue has their own separate continuity, as well as the fact that these same comic book industries would always reboot their franchise in order to fit the status quo. What's more, in relation to the other issue of how most Western comics have a non-existent storyline, rather than having each story progress more linearly, many of them progress concurrently like going through a web. And for that, I feel it's even hard to find out the exact order of how and when these stories are taking place. So, while it may be true that you can't start reading any specific comic book issue, you also don't exactly know where to start reading them. Thus, you won't just be confused about the story, there's a high chance that you won't understand the context, and that goes especially true when a majority of the events in Western comics tend to be very inconsistent with each other. I mean, that's just me, but it's pretty much what I think about Western comics, and why having a storyline within every manga series is giving them the advantage, since each one is relatively much easier to follow, or at the very least, somewhat easier to get a general gist of the overall plot and some idea of its destination. Now obviously, not every manga that has a storyline are perfect. Some, if not most, can easily be flawed or just don't make any sense at all, which is also why you see a lot getting axed, dropped or just won't last long because they don't get enough of the public's attention. And for the ones that really hit it off, the quality usually starts to go down when the series drags on a bit too long or when it starts reaching the end. In the case of the latter, just look how bad the ending was for JJK or even its sequel series. I could also mention the ending of the Bleach manga, but I'm going to give that one a pass since there were certain factors that forced the mangaka to quickly end his own series. Still, whether each storyline is flawed or not, it really depends on people's own preferences. And if anything, it shows how manga industries are a bit more careful on what to publish so they don't get oversaturated. Plus, other advantages to having a storyline is that it makes world building in each manga series more dynamic and narrative driven, giving us an immersive feel, as well as getting us real invested into the story. Not to mention, it makes sure that said story doesn't lose track of what it's building up towards. Take One Piece for example. It's massively long, but the way it continues to expand its own lore leaves a lot of fans in wanting more of what comes next. And despite having so many events going on, the way it's broken into separate story arcs does help prevent the series from losing sight of the goal it's trying to reach. What's more, in contrast to how the stories in Western comics are organized, the series of events in each manga story are ordered by chapter and volume numbers. This way, readers, especially those who are new to manga, wouldn't just make things easier on themselves by knowing where to start reading exactly, they would also be able to check their progress and easily go back to certain points to reread the series in case they forget. Also, as a way for old and new readers to keep up with so many manga series as well as anime series, it's actually important that they all have some form of ending. Granted, some can end up being controversial, and even though I do wish that some manga and anime series last a bit longer, it is better to end them than having an endless journey that could potentially ruin a character's own character arc. Case in point, just look at the situation that happened around Spider-Man, Mary Jane, and a hated character named Paul. Of course, it doesn't stop them from getting some spin-offs and sequels, but if it's to expand the main story, then it's okay, just as long as they make sure they're better than Boruto. Most of all, I do like how many of these manga stories contain some form of consequences within them. Like, they really help to showcase how high the stakes are in some story arcs, and on occasion might help with the main character's overall growth and development. One such consequence is that if one character with no plot armor was to suddenly die at any point in the story, and not get revived by pulling a Dragon Ball multiple times, it could very well change up the series' tone. Although it's not something I and some fans want, especially since it might not always work out well, but it's one of the things that make manga stories engaging and unpredictable as they can, so it can sometimes be essential for the plot. Anyway, I think I gave enough reason as to how having a storyline is allowing manga to beat Western comics. There are other reasons too, like this portion of Jim Lee's statement where he says that manga has a much wider genre. After all, while Western comics would mostly just focus on sci-fi and fantasy, manga and anime will include genres that are inspired from real-life elements, some of which like soccer and cooking, which Jim Lee has also mentioned, and we even got ones like basketball, boxing, and some elements of gaming. Moreover, I feel that manga and anime creators are a bit more creative with their genres, releasing some that has racing, giant robots, and people going to another world. Of course, it does help that many of these genres are specifically written for the interest and enjoyment of certain audiences, so if one genre isn't your favorite or to your liking, there are plenty of others to choose from to fit your need. Like in my case, I personally enjoy a series that has elements of martial arts, with one being my personal favorite, Kengan Ashura, a series that's essentially a large tournament arc, but it's the best type of arc I should add. Having said that, there are times where these same genres do get overused a lot, and some main theme concepts within one or two manga series gets recycled for another series. Biggest example is the isekai genre, and believe me, Japan has made a lot of those. Regardless, as long as they are different and not completely copy and pasted, some manga and anime series can stand out in their own way. Another reason why I think manga is beating comics is because of the various main and maybe side characters, and unlike the superheroes in Western comics, who are made to represent as certain ideas, I find most characters in anime and manga to be more relatable, especially for all the struggles they have to go through, the many challenges they have to face in order to grow, and how some had to work hard to reach their nearly impossible goal. Additionally, I would argue that anime and manga characters have more depth in them, at least enough to make them less obscure, and more memorable than a majority of comic book characters. For example, just look at some main characters like Deku, Naruto, maybe Ichigo, and someone as complex as Eren Yeager. So, if someone were to say the anime or manga characters are one-dimensional, well, they are just being delusional. Also, just for the sake of gooning, I find most female characters in anime and manga more appealing than those in Western comics. Lastly, my biggest takeaway of how manga is beating Western comics is none other than the artwork. Now, for the most part, I'm not trying to say that the drawings in manga are superior to the ones in comic books. If anything, they are equally good in their own right, both for being highly detailed and having intricate designs. That said, I do find the artwork in each manga series a lot better in drawing out a character's raw emotion, as well as adding scenes where it really feels like the objects and characters are moving in the manga panels. Above all else, they are much more diverse, which is a given since each manga drawing is done by various respective manga artists, and they all have their own unique and consistent art style. In the late Akira Toriyama's case, his known drawings of Dragon Ball can be seen as being more imaginative, while also containing whimsical elements with dynamism in action scenes. For Yusuke Murata, his extremely detailed artwork in One Punch Man is well regarded for having fluid movement and dynamic panel composition. Next is Kohei Horikoshi, whose work on My Hero Academia is famous for having a blend of Western style and Japanese style artwork, as well as having a mix of realism and exaggeration. Then there's Eiichiro Oda's work on One Piece, a bit cartoonish and silly by nature, but helps set the comedic and adventurous tone. There's also Tite Kubo's artwork of Bleach, which is praised for having cinematic compositions, sharpness, and attention to detail, not to mention how every Bleach character always got that drip. And finally, there's Sakiru Hakuzono, a recent manga artist whose work on Kagurabachi is best known for having cinematic framing, heavy shadows, and dynamic combat panels. Frankly, I could go on and mention other existing artwork, but that will take forever since even a lesser known or underrated manga series has some pretty amazing artwork of their own. In any case, no matter which series you are reading, I can without doubt say that compared to every comic strips, almost every manga panel within every manga series are so artistic, they're good enough to be considered wallpaper material. You might not agree with it, but that's what I come to believe. Okay, that's basically it for this video. Took me some time than I care to admit when making this, but I was able to say what I need to say. However, if you have any other reasons as to how and why manga is beating Western comics, just leave a comment down below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.